So where did we leave off? Remind me, I'm old. I need help.
I think we left off at Amendment 6.
Yeah.
And we're turning on to 7, I think now.
Yeah, correct. But where did we leave off in our discussion? What were we talking about?
Culture.
Culture. And what were we talking about culture?
Do something that's outside of your comfort zone.
That's right. We did talk about a practical application this week of doing something outside of our comfort zone to build culture. Does anyone want to share maybe some experiences they had? Did we forget the assignment?
I went to youth group. A youth group.
You did.
You were one in 4? Mm-hmm.
Met new people. Anyone else?
I feel like I didn't really get the chance this week because I didn't really see anyone like that is outside my comfort zone. Like, I feel like I didn't really get the chance because I didn't really have an opportunity to do that. Because with the people I know, doing things like that would be more normal than out of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I wouldn't say this is completely out of my comfort zone as well, but I've had a few conversations with my grandparents and my dad about different things, especially applications and stuff for my life. And the last conversation I had with my grandparents was actually something about our last essay. And the part of it that was like, I guess you could say out of my comfort zone would be what we were talking about, which was more spiritual stuff. And what was it? It was, what was our essay about?
Humility and
Wow,
pride.
humility and pride. So we talked about a lot about that. And it was different for me. So I guess you could say that was somewhat out of my comfort zone. And then I feel like even sometimes when you talk to your parents about certain things, it can be out of your comfort zone. And so I did that as well.
Yeah.
A few times this past couple of weeks. So.
Good.
I was kind of trying to hang out with more of the people I don't usually, like in our group and stuff, like the younger kids, which isn't like out of my comfort zone, but it's what I don't usually do, so.
Right. And that was the lesson, right? It's not always just being uncomfortable. The point of it is, in building culture, is to do things that you don't normally do. Yeah, good. And was that a positive experiences, negative experiences?
Pretty positive.
Yeah. So yeah, culture shifting, and when we talk about this too, right? Like we're currently talking about culture from a more national standpoint, but any culture has to be changed by the individual, right? So that's where real change comes from. It's from each individual person, and then it's taking that culture as you're learning it, and then engaging in conversation, relationship, right? And so, yeah, as you're maturing and getting older, right, there's, for all of you, likely, there's kind of a different conversations that take place. You know, you're transitioning from those kid conversations with your parents to now weightier, deeper, more profound things. And, you know, I think parents have, you know, perspectives and insights and things, but don't always see things the way that you see them. And so you have to sift through, right, the information that you're given. Do any of you ever struggle with feedback that you're given from maybe parents, grandparents, people in authority? It's still a challenge for teenagers to listen to the feedback, right? Do you guys ever get to the conversation about back in our day, or we've lived a little bit longer, or we know, right?
That's you.
Yeah, well, that is me.
No, but just you saying that.
Right, and so what we're talking about there is ultimately, you know, as different generations come up and there's different influences around generations, there's different conversations that need to take place. And we'll even see this within the amendments themselves, because we're getting ready to wind down talking about the initial amendments, and the next week we'll get into talking about, excuse me, amendments that were added during the Reconstruction. Does anyone remember from any history what the Reconstruction was?
No, I don't know what it is, actually.
So, the Great Civil War took place within our country, right? And there was a pretty divided group experience there, right? The North versus the South. The South breaks away, secedes from the Union, and the majority of the reason is because the South wanted to have their own rights. They wanted states' rights. They predominantly pushed for that. And so it was much more than just slavery, although slavery seems to be the one major focal point of the Civil War. But there was a lot of issues there as far as what Southern states felt. The way that they lived, the culture that they had was radically different from the North. And so what we see is the division of our country started primarily because there's these two warring cultures at play. And Lincoln decided to go to war ultimately over it because he wanted to keep the Union together and strong, and had the foresight to see that we were much better together than we were apart, right? And getting back to that first initial thought of we the people in order to form a more perfect Union, right? And so he was standing on that as his major impetus for going to war. And then we ultimately see states like Virginia, who and Robert E. Lee in particular, who go to war for no other reason than the North stepped foot in Virginia and went to war. And so as soon as that happened, Lee joined in, and Lee at that time was a little apprehensive about war. What we don't see a lot of talked about historically is that Robert E. Lee was against slavery, even though he was in the South. He was one of the major figures who was against it. He often gets painted in the picture of being pro-slavery because he was the lead general for the South, but that's not true. In fact, many of the main generals found it appalling. And so what happened then at the end of that was called the Reconstruction period. So the Civil War is settled, right? The North wins. And we go through now a season where Lincoln is going to be setting out to bring back some order. And then what happens to Lincoln? He's assassinated, right? And so then we have this great period of time where there's still, even though the Civil War has kind of been settled, there's some of this kind of confusion, and where Lincoln was a really strong, assertive leader, all of a sudden we don't have that. His vice president who became president was not really good, was not a good example to the nation, was kind of pushing against some of even what Johnson, pushing against even some of what he wanted. Then he was voted out, ultimately impeached, and then we see Ulysses S. Grant, who ended the war as the main general for the North, who took over. So Reconstruction was about rebuilding. And so we'll see in, I believe it's Amendments 13, 14, and 15, where now we have amendments that are set up to address slavery and some of the wrong decisions by the Supreme Court that they're now trying to make application so that there actually is equal treatment of everyone under the law. And so it's kind of, again, a major cultural shift. And again, as we're talking about culture, it's really important for us to understand that as individuals, we have a lot of influence over cultures. How we live, the things we say, right? Our speech, the way we act, the way we live, the way we interact relationally, how we interact with one another defines what culture truly is. And so getting back to the Constitution, the idea of the Constitution, right, is a set of rules or principles that should guide our lives. And as we discussed last week, there are certainly things within the amendments themselves that we take for granted, rights that we have that we don't really worry about, that we just, that are there, that just seem like that's always been the case. And yet when we look throughout history, we see, and even current world events, we see that America is uniquely different. America in many ways is set apart from the rest of the world. And it's why I think studies of things like the Constitution and America as a whole, as a cultural study, is really important. It's not perfect, but it ultimately, I think, gives us a really clear picture of how things can change for the better, right? We went from monarchy and rule of people who had money and had lots amount of authority and people who didn't, to now a nation which is co-laboring, co-equals. And what we find now in our history as we look at our country, kind of a challenge for your generation is fighting against some of what now is established as, again, pulling away of politicians tend to be more financially, they have a little bit more, and there's kind of this ruling class now, again. And this is a challenge that we're kind of faced with generationally. And so why are we talking about that? Because ultimately we need to understand now not just culture as a whole, but the divisions of culture between people. Not just generationally, right? What are some other ways that you could say practically you could separate out cultures, like different cultures, even in the midst of our people? So we know ages, right? Like, so there's parents, and then there's your guys' generation, which is a little different, and there's even younger than you that you could consider another generation in some sense. So what other differences or different cultures could take place in our midst?
There's a leadership.
Yeah. So leadership as a culture, and if there's a culture that is leadership, what's the other culture to that then?
Followers.
People who follow, right? People who are under submission to that leadership, right? Are there any difficulties you think in that culture? Or what are some difficulties that could come out of that culture, having a group of leaders and a group of followers?
There could be a problem with the followers not submitting themselves,
So followers who don't want to submit,
or leaders that do not lead correctly.
could be leaders that don't lead correctly, right?
I don't know if this really relates to it, but even different families can have different ways
Yes.
of doing things and stuff. So it
Absolutely.
can be, hard to work together sometimes.
Right. And so the language that you're raised with, right? The different dynamics, because again, each family comes from different backgrounds. Right? So, I mean, and there could be challenges. I'll give you a good example of that. Both my wife and I come from a background of where our families are divorced. And so that radically shifts, right? And so you guys have parents that weren't divorced. So that brings different dynamics to the table, right? Those are influences. It doesn't mean that you have to follow those influences, right? But there's challenges. So there's other things within your guys' life, right? So for at least the Pinson family, right, there was a lot of shifting as far as moving, right, from place to place, right? And so that shapes certain things. And again, culture can be shaped either from a negative perspective, right, how we perceive things, or we can look at things positively, right? And that's why it's really critical for a central culture to be unified. Because if we don't have the mindset towards, or the intention of being unified together, then what tends to happen? Things fray, right? I'd imagine moving, I know moving is difficult, but when you move away from friends that you've established, right, that can be a difficult season and a challenge. And you can take that one of two ways, right? You can become embittered by it and resentful by it, or you can see it as a natural flow of life, or you can kind of be in between, like there's goods and bads, right? But ultimately, the individual person has to reconcile with themselves the culture that's established. So we have leadership to followers, we have each different family dynamics. What are some other different cultures that we experience? What about guys and girls? They're different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? The things that men experience growing up are different than things that girls experience growing up. That can be certainly true. What about as just mere individuals? Even within our own households, we have our own cultures that we shape. I mean, I'm assuming all of the siblings, you guys don't all respond the same way. I think you could ask any sibling. I'll ask Kayla. So since you guys are here, our siblings, can you think in your mind if I said the troublemaker of the house? Don't say it out loud, but there's something that goes to your mind. Do you guys? If I said troublemaker in your guys' houses, would you automatically assume somebody in your mind? How about the bookworm? Somebody who studies, right? Somebody who's How about the quiet one? Right? So it can be easy to form judgments, right? But our temperaments and our personalities can create its own culture.
No, if it almost.
But thinking about those individuals, now think about those individuals, let's take maybe the quiet person for a minute. Is there people that when you see that quiet person and they're around, all of a sudden they're different? They're not as quiet anymore? Right? And so there's influences. And so we have all of these cultures that are happening all at once. And again, the difficulty is, in order for us to form a more perfect union, right, as if we the people, there has to be an endeavor. And we have to consider then all of the culture that takes place within the united group. We touched on this a little bit last week as we're talking about these articles, right? Because we begin to break down criminals. And it's really easy within most societies to kind of write criminals off as being other than, right? So those are bad people. Those are bad apples, whatever, and we write them off. And yet we see within our Constitution that we really are intentional about protecting the rights of people who are accused, but even people who become guilty. There is a real intention in our country to make sure that we represent all peoples equally. And so we'll get into that a little bit. And so let's take a look at Article 7, Amendment 7. In suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20. Now that doesn't seem like a whole lot of money, huh? $20. But back then, this was a substantial amount of money, right? Quite a bit for the majority of the country. The right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. So what does this mean? What's a civil trial?
Is it when you go on trial for a crime you might have committed?
Nope, that would be a criminal trial.
But what type of trial is it?
This is a civil trial.
Just you protesting against someone?
Yeah, so this is just kind of person to person. And so it might be a property dispute, right? It might be, you sold me a mule, and I think it had an issue with it and it died, and I think you sold it wrongly to me, and I think you're trying to get one over on me, and that mule cost me over $20, so I'm going to have a jury trial. And so why does this particular thing here, this idea of having trials where one person can come into court of law against another person to settle a grievance, how does that represent the idea of forming a more perfect union?
Like Judge Judy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Judge Judy would be a good example of civil trials. Yeah.
Sorry, what was your question?
So in that example, using Judge Judy as an example, why is that something that leads us towards the ideal of a more perfect union? As silly as that sounds, right?
Yeah, I guess it's a more civil way of like negotiating things rather than like doing it like just one person to another if it gets to that point. But it creates a better way of doing things.
Yeah, perfect.
For two people.
Yeah, a civil way, right?
Yeah.
A civil trial is meant to bring two parties together to come to a common understanding. And so you have a mediator, right? Again, this is getting back to that idea of the three different branches of government, and the judiciary being kind of the one that levels the playing field and then determines the rule of law as it's stated here. And so, yeah, we want to make sure that we have mediators, right? Because sometimes in life, people don't agree. And when people don't agree, it would tend to, if we didn't work towards resolving it, right? Generally, as a rule, somebody ends up kind of getting the bad end of the deal there. We talked about this when we were talking about compromise, right? If you're the type of person who lets people walk all over you in life, what is the chances of people continuing to use you to get what they want, right? And then there's the people who will use their authority or their power, right? That they will compromise other people. But the goal here is that properly submitted to, right? A judiciary that's properly submitted to will give just answers to the issues. And so the judge is meant to be impartial. Why? So that we, the people, everyone can have equal representation. And so the idea of this is, again, getting back to the thought of, if it's somebody who's poor and somebody who's rich, they will be equals in the eyes of the law, right? Have you ever heard the saying, justice is blind? You ever see the picture of the blind lady and she's holding the scales? Well, that's the concept of judicial temperament, is meant to be impartial, right? And that comes from Greek and Roman understandings of law and rule. And so we want to make sure that, again, we understand that, yeah, the reason it helps us form a more perfect union is because we're submitted to other people to help us address our grievances. Who in your life do you guys go to when you have issues, say with a sibling, a friend? Is there somebody you go to help you make judgment?
A parent.
Parent?
I guess it depends on the situation.
Is there anyone who goes outside of a parent?
The only other people I've gone to outside of parents probably my grandparents.
Grandparents?
Yeah.
Why did you go to parents or grandparents?
Because I know they have the wisdom that can help me.
Yeah.
Can be trusted.
Wisdom.
Some can,
Trust.
anyways.
Yeah, and so again, we're looking for somebody who will judge rightly and judge wisely. Have you ever went to somebody to try to get some insight and they've given you feedback or counsel that you didn't like or that you weren't expecting? Did you heed their advice or did you fight against it?
Sometimes when because sometimes people only go to certain people because they know they only tell them what they want to hear.
Yes.
And sometimes they won't go to the right people because sometimes they know what they're going to be told, but don't want to hear it. So.
Right. And
Yeah.
so one of the great breakdowns, if we had a system in which you could go to whomever to decide whatever, right? Again, what would happen? People in a position of power or authority or wealth would be able to go to the person they could influence. And so the inclination here is we want to go to people who are just and are good. But again, thinking about this from a cultural shift, in order for there to be a more perfect union, not only does the judiciary have to be fair, and it's talking about this here, right? There has to be civil trials, but the individuals who are going must submit themselves to the authority. That's a major thing that gets missed in the modern context, right? We live in a world, you guys alluded to this, where people will just want to go to whomever will side with them, right? Think about a disagreement, right? Do you go to friends who are going to give you counsel, or do you go to talk to a friend to get them to side up with you, right? And again, it may not be as mean-spirited as, well, I'm going to go and tell this friend because I know they'll be with me. It may be just as simple as just complaining about something or being frustrated and then unloading it on your friend. Have you ever had that happen where you're frustrated, so you share it with somebody, now they're frustrated?
Yeah.
And then you get over it, but that person's still frustrated, right? And so we have to guard against, again, thinking about it from culture building. In order to form a more perfect union, there's responsibility certainly on the government, but there's a huge responsibility on myself to ensure that I am following the mandates, the rule of law, the structure that's been laid out before me. All right, let's move on to the next one. Amendment 8. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Why does this create a more perfect union? So this is criminal cases, and so
What is
this
bail?
Bail? So bail would be, yeah, so you get arrested, right, because you're suspected of committing a crime and you're in jail, but it's a pretty significant thing. So you go before the judge and the judge says, well, I'm going to give you $100,000 bail. So what that means is somebody can come and pay $100,000 so you don't have to stay in jail until your court case, so you can roam free. But if you skip out, that $100,000 is gone. When they catch you, you
Yeah.
get thrown in jail
I watch-
anyways.
I watched a lot of things that like a bail bonds company.
Mhm.
They like go to arrest people or fail to show up to court
Yep.
or something.
Yep. Yeah, so they
That's what I heard
insure,
here.
the bail bondsmen insure getting people who have charged with crimes to court. And so, yeah, they take out, I mean, and it's all about leveraging money, so they get a payment to ensure that happens.
Mhm.
Right? And so if you're a bail bondsman, right, you're not going to necessarily bail out somebody without having some collateral there.
Yeah.
And so in this case, what we're saying here is we want to make sure it's not excessive. Not excessive bail, no excessive fine. So a fine would be like, somebody's jaywalking, and I'm going to be like, that's $5 million for jaywalking, right? That seems excessive, What would be reasonable? That's what we're looking for. Nor, it says here, nor cruel or unusual punishments inflicted. And this one is the one major one that comes up against people who have been convicted of things like murder and condemned to death. And so we've had arguments about why certain forms of punishment, like hanging and things like that, are cruel and unusual punishment. So why are these protections here? Again, for criminals. Why does this create a more perfect union? Because it would be easy to have the sentiment of like that person is just a bad person. Who cares about their rights?
Because we have to pay for what, literally and figuratively, you have to pay for what you've done.
Sure. Yeah, so you have to pay, but why? It says here excessive. Why shouldn't it be excessive?
I don't know what excessive means.
Like over the top. Like, again, for the idea of jaywalking, which means crossing the road without going to a crosswalk or crossing traffic, right? Why shouldn't it be a $5 million fine?
Because that's unjust.
Why is it unjust?
Because that's not like, I didn't walk up to someone and just murder them on the street.
Right? So now we're talking about degrees of guilt, right? What if the state of Washington passed a law for that jaywalking was a $5 million fine?
Then whoever thought it wrong should protest about it.
Well, it goes further than protest. Again, you have the right to go before the courts to say this is an infringement upon my rights. If that happened, you could take the state of Washington to court and say, listen, according to this article here, it says excessive bail nor excessive fines. This is excessive. And then how you would prove that, right? You would say, well, this is... You might get out a chart. Every other state does this amount of money or whatever. And so $5 million seems pretty crazy, right? And would the courts generally side with you on that? Yeah, probably $5 million fine. But let's say it was a $100 fine. Is that excessive? Well, again, it would be incumbent upon you taking the state to court, which is your right, to try to prove why that would be excessive. And so a lot of the language, again, that we see here can be intentionally vague. And it's important for us to understand that because there needs to be some room for the judicial branch, the judges, to make right judgments. In fact, as we go to the next article here, so that we can keep moving on, Article 9, Amendment 9 is the most misunderstood and kind of like, why is it there? It makes no sense at all. So let's read it real quick. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. What does that mean? Anyone want to venture a guess as to what that means? All right, yeah, for us, it's a whole lot of nothing, right? It just, what does that mean? Unenumerated rights is what it's talking about. And so for us to understand this, again, we have to go back to historical understanding of cultures. There were two factions of belief, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Right? The Federalists wanted a really strong form of central government. They wanted the federal government to be the primary impetus for everything, right? And so this huge federal government, and then the states had to submit to there. Well, the Anti-Federalists wanted more of a balance, and they said, in fact, they kind of pushed more towards states' rights being higher up than the federal government's rights. And so that way we have what? We have each state, which is represented as a culture, who kind of is different. There's kind of, there's Delaware and North Carolina. Those are different worlds, right? The state of New York is different than Virginia. There's different things that are taking place. And so the anti-federalists, again, were kind of pushing back towards this idea of having too much structure into the federal government. Now, one of the arguments that took place here was that all of a sudden, we're writing down all of these rights, and you had people that are kind of pushing back and saying, the danger in writing down all of the rights and being super specific is that what we can foresee happening is some point in the future where somebody goes, well, that wasn't covered. It doesn't say it here, so you don't have that right. And so with again, some foresight, what this general article amendment states is that there's a bunch of rights that we might have that we're not really thinking through here and that we're not writing down. And so we have to kind of write something out, flesh something out that empowers the judiciary and empowers the legislative branch to come to some understanding of what rights will look like in the future generations. Because again, they understood that cultures shift and cultures change, and that at some point in time there might be a need to define a certain right that they hadn't even thought about. So now, all of a sudden, this is going to be really important for future laws. One really good example of that is at this time, when the nation was set out, women did not have the right to vote. We would see that wasn't spelled out, not until much later in other amendments where that was spelled out. Well, all of a sudden, this whole idea of unenumerated rights would be, okay, well, let's take a look back now at the Constitution and figure out what were some rights here that were kind of generally laid out. We believe that now that women should have the right to vote because this is an unenumerated right. Like, they're equal, right? They're not property. And so we see that now what this amendment does is it gives a lot of freedom for us to make and address changes within our own Constitution to improve things. In fact, when we talk about the Reconstruction, this unenumerated rights, Article 9 will be integral in playing a part to really resolve this whole idea or issue of slavery, which is a pretty major thing, right? You're still hearing a lot about this idea of systemic racism. You guys ever hear that within the United States? It's a pretty big push right now. We have a lot of stuff going on around our nation where there's still some discomfort with some of the things that have happened in the past. And so basically what this is saying is we need to leave the door open for us to further define rights that maybe we're not understanding. But the problem with this is that, again, it's intentionally vague. And so what does that mean, right? What do we have a God-given right for versus something that is just a preference? And so this is continues to play itself out in life in real time. And so let's think about, so what are some things that you would consider is your right? Whether it's a human or as somebody has the freedom in America, right? As a citizen of the United States, what is a right that you hold?
To be treated equally.
To be treated equally under the law, right? The Constitution says that. That's your right. I have to treat you all equally under the law. Yeah, so when we go to court, it doesn't matter what you look like, what you think, what you believe, and it's important, again, because that means that even the criminal, somebody who's been charged multiple times, is treated with the same deference in the law as somebody who's never been in trouble with the law before. And that creates a more perfect union because, again, the inclination moves towards proving people are guilty and not assuming. And what it also does is it forces my hand to say I can't treat somebody who has more money or that I like more better than somebody who maybe I don't like as much or who doesn't have money. It treats us all as equals. What are some other rights?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, yeah. Let's make it harder. What are some rights you enjoy in your household? Do you have the right to tell your parents whatever you think and feel?
In a certain range.
Well, let's talk about that, right? So you have the right to say what you want, but there are consequences,
You might
are there
get-
not,
you
for
might get
if you
slapped.
if you say certain things. But then there's the whole part of that is there's a lot, like when I said that, you're like, oh no, you can't say anything we want. Well, you could technically, right? But it wouldn't benefit you. And so the right is certainly there, but why would you refrain from that right? Well, out of respect, out of deference to the authority that parents have in your life, hopefully. But has anyone ever said something they probably shouldn't have? Were you found guilty in the court of law of mom and dad?
Yeah.
There was punishment inflicted, right? Discipline, imprisonment. Yeah, all of those things, which do what? Which create a healthy culture.
Yeah.
And so as we look again, and trying to use this as practically as we can, that the reason that these amendments are in there are to protect our fundamental rights, right? And so we talked about this a little bit. The freedom of speech is an important right. We all have it. But properly understood, it doesn't mean I get to say whatever I want to say whenever I want to say it. That's technically true. You have that right. But somebody who understands their freedoms and their liberties and their rights appropriately does what? They bridle their own tongue because they know at times it will not be beneficial. For what? In order to form a more perfect union, right? And so properly understood, even in the household, why is there authority in place and respect that should be given? Because it benefits not just the parent and not just the child, but it benefits the union, the relationship. What we know to be true more than that is it honors God, which is the ultimate relationship, right? Which is the ultimate union that we're looking at. And so these unenumerated rights kind of paint for you, even in your own life. There are probably things that you're experiencing as you're growing up, right? Where you're having a little bit more privilege now as you're maturing, right? Wasn't your privileges limited much more when you were younger? Some of you are earning the right to get behind a motor vehicle and point it in the general direction of other motor vehicles. And the hope is what? That you will keep it between the lines on your side of the road and not run anyone over, right? Those are rights that you are earning as you mature, right? So those are some unenumerated rights that you have, right? That will come to fruition in due season as there's a cultural shift. And so we want to make sure that we remember this one. In fact, it's one of those we kind of keep in the back of our minds. For the context of the Constitution as a whole. And it's something we should be mindful of, again, of what are some, maybe some things that we don't think about when it comes to now relational dynamics. We often think about, right, what we like, what we want, what we need, what we feel. We think about ourselves a lot. Do we consider the rights of other people? And again, at the heart of this, it's trying to get us to think. If we're thinking about culture here now, shaping a culture in which, what about all of the things I don't have the answers to? I don't have the understanding for. And so culture cannot be rigid. There has to be a level of flexibility to it, correct? Even in the building of the Lord's house. For us, there has to be a flexibility. Why? Because God is not confused. He knows exactly how he's building things, but we don't. We don't understand, right? We see in part, we know in part. But the hope is that we are able to be not rigid, but flexible when we have wisdom given to us. Again, I want you to think in terms of this, like when correction was brought to you, are you the type of person that takes that correction and really seeks the Lord in it and seeks to yield and submit to the authority in your life? Or are you one that pushes back? I think the honest answer is we can be both. But why is Why is an individual in their own culture that has a submissive heart to properly understood authority healthy? Because it creates a more perfect union. You said it well. There's got to be leaders. There's got to be followers. Not everyone can lead.
So the couple questions that I had.
Not in every context, right? There has to be, in certain cultures, right? There has to be a head of household. That brings health, right? If there's warring factions, then that creates disunity, not just between the warring factions, but for all who are in the context of that culture. And so the unenumerated rights leaves us the availability for there to be further understanding down the road. That's a good thing. And the lesson here is that we don't become rigid in the way that we think and see culture, because culture is always shifting. True culture is something that is living, right? The building of God's house is certainly fixed, how the Lord does it, but the context of how it moves within a people group is not always as fixed. It's flexible, it's pliable, it's organic, right? And the good news in that is it gives us the opportunity to change. Because maybe in that culture, we're the troublemaker, we're the one who's resistant. Or maybe in that culture too, we've maybe gotten a little proud and thought, I'm the one who always follows. But no, it gives us that kind of wiggle room to learn and grow. All right, moving on to Amendment 10. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What does that mean? Again, this is a conversation between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists here. Federalists wanted a strong federal government as preeminent over the states, and the Anti-Federalists wanted to make sure that they preserved states' rights as being primary. So let's break this down a little bit. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. What does that mean? What does delegated mean?
I don't know.
Okay. Who knows what delegated means? Not handed over. And so so certain powers, right? Certain authority that is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. So what this says is the Constitution gives what? It gives the federal government very clear parameters. It's delegating the power that the government has, right? Just like the president only has certain powers. There's supposed to be executive powers. The legislature, right, the House of Representatives, the Senate, is supposed to legislate. The judiciary is supposed to be judge over those things. And so the president should not be the judge. The judge should not write rules. We have really clear separation of powers. And so what this starts out here as saying is that the powers that are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, okay, so it's limited. Whatever power that we have given the federal government is contained within this box, nor is it prohibited by the states. So as long as there's nothing within the Constitution that says the states can't do this, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And so what this means is if it's not spelled out in the Constitution clearly, in limiting the powers of the federal government, nor restricting the states from doing so, the states have free rights to write the laws within their own states. It's preserving this idea of cultures being different, vastly different, right? New York City, vastly different than Port Angeles, Washington. Vastly different, right? Texas, way different than California. And so there's again some flexibility here. Now, why is this important, and how does it lead to a more perfect union?
You wouldn't want to have one culture.
Okay.
It would make no sense. Like it might form a greater union, but then nobody gets to have their own opinion because you all think the same. You all do the same.
So it protects the right for freedom within the states.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, like you were saying with the authority in just a house, having that authority over people, but still like limiting and kind of including everyone, like having someone that has a say to benefit others and kind of establish things.
Yes.
I think so.
Yeah.
But still, we're not losing that view that like the people are still shouldn't be infringed
Mm-hmm.
in things.
Good. Any other thoughts? Yeah, I think you said it well. Again, this comes back to the relational context to which any healthy culture grows. There has to be absolutes, right? We see that within the rights that are given to the federal government. But those rights and those powers are limited to a very fixed thing on purpose, so that those who fall in the rest of the culture have a voice. Again, this is kind of affirming the rights that went before it. And what it's saying here is we're going to give preference to states' rights over the inclination for a federal government. And the reason why this is significant and important to us is that it is easy to corrupt one thing. It is much more difficult to corrupt 50. And so in our Constitution, the way that this is built is, again, a check and balance here. If the federal government becomes too powerful, the states then have some recourse to kind of push away from some of that. And then they can, again, go to the courts. And so we have states all the time that file legislation and court cases against the federal government. So it's the people versus the United States government. In fact, very specific people that will go up against the United States government. We see this happen a lot. Presidents or legislatures make determinations and decisions, and a state says, no. That's infringing upon the state's rights. And then you look at the Constitution, it's the judge's job to say, okay, is the federal government limited in this? And if they are limited clearly in the Constitution, then that law is not constitutional. It has to be cast down. Is it something that's now? Is this a law that is prohibited? So, for example, now, if let's say the state of Washington decided we're not going to let women vote anymore, well, that would get cast down because the state cannot write a law that contradicts what the Constitution says, right? So constitutionally, we see in another amendment, women have the right to vote, women's suffrage. Very clear, very specific. The state cannot override the federal government.
Okay, perfect.
And so that's important. Why is that important relationally?
Talk to you later. Bye.
So thinking about again, households, right? Each household has its own set of rules, right? That your parents have really clearly defined rules for you. So what about rules that are maybe those haven't been communicated clearly, like it's never been set and discussed? What takes place then? Do you as individuals just do what you want and kind of go, we'll see how this works? Right? There's a really bad saying, right? It's easier to get forgiveness than it is to get permission. You ever hear that? So do you, as an individual, do you act out on your own, or do you seek counsel for where you're not clearly understanding the rule?
Done both.
You've done both.
Yeah.
So, and you don't have to get into the weeds here. You don't have to be specific. Which one of them went better for you, getting counsel or not?
Probably getting counsel.
And why did that work better for you?
That is definitely something we can help with.
Because it was
Yeah, so we charge $19.95 for a team
not doing something on
2
your
hours
own
long.
Mhm.
and going to someone who
Elijah, why are you doing that?
What?
Making faces at me.
So, like relationally, did you feel, even though maybe doing it the wrong way, right? There was disappointment or whatever. Did you feel differently when you did it the right way?
yeah.
Right. There's a relational. Is there not a difference relationally? There's a cleaner conscience. There's a better feeling, even though sometimes doing the right thing is much more difficult. Right? Is that not safe to say generally as a rule? We all have the capacity to do things we should not, ought not. But again, the context of any healthy culture, what we must understand is there are subcultures. And the subculture needs to submit to the greater culture. But the way that this is written, again, think about it this way, is again, the Constitution, right? The federal government, the states, the people.
Correct.
What is the intention of the healthy culture? To build up its people. Not to build up its federal powers, not to build up its state powers, but to build up individuals in being responsible, productive members of a society who function with the ideal of we the people in order to form a more perfect union. And so how do we as individuals live within the context of a culture? We submit to the authorities that are in place. And when we don't have something that's clearly defined, right? That there needs to be kind of something that's worked out there. Because what will happen here, and it plays itself out in our history, is that we'll say, oh, well, that's not covered in the Constitution, so the states can do whatever they want. Well, this is something that, in part, leads to, ultimately, the Civil War, is you have a bunch of states now that will begin to fight for their specific rights and saying, well, that's not addressed in the Constitution. This is where slavery really starts to come into play, right? Because there's nothing that's clearly defined. Is there in the Constitution to this point that says slavery is wrong? No, at first glance it doesn't appear so. And yet what we know to be true when we're properly understanding, and by the way, that was the Supreme Court, what the Supreme Court upheld was that slavery was basically okay before the Civil War. The Dred Scott opinion. There's all of this stuff that is going, no, this is wrong. We know is wrong. But what do we understand now as we look back? No, the unenumerated rights should have covered that. Right? Anyone who is properly understanding is that we all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're endowed by our Creator, right? You remember this language? But what happened is you had certain groups of people, certain cultures of people that wanted to isolate others from it. And again, this gets into a proper understanding of where the federal government should have protected the rights of marginalized peoples. And it didn't always. And so what this does is it shows for us the reserve powers. The 10th Amendment shows us both, again, the positives and the negatives here. We have to understand both. But what it does is it affords us the ability to, in a healthy culture, understand that there are individuals, we the people, there are smaller groups, family units, and there is a bigger group, right? So in our context, we have multiple families coming together to meet and to submit to whom? To God, the Father. But we have not elected leaders, right? Because God has appointed and ordained very specifically who will lead. And in that culture, who's responsible to submit to them? All of us. Right? But there's also kind of this understanding in that kind of this umbrella that primarily there's this really big push for the heads of household in particular to really be submitted, not that others aren't, but to really represent what? So I represent the Lacasse family coming before the leadership. I am you can say senator, whatever. I'm representative of my family, and I am ultimately responsible, right, to submit to the leadership, to submit to the Lord. And what that does is, in a healthy understanding, is it trickles down to who? To my kids, to my wife, right? And it doesn't mean that Nicole and I aren't working together, right? We're co-laborers. We're having conversations. There's different voices, different opinions, and we're wrestling through things, but we're ultimately seeking what? The greater good. And then we have liberties within each family unit, right? If it's not clearly going against something that we believe, there's freedom in that. But there are certain things that there's going to be, clear, like these are boundaries for our people. And so we even see the self play it out. Now, again, the states or the individual family units, if they don't understand maybe how to operate within that, it is good, is it not, for the states to try to work together with the federal government to come to some understanding of what's going to be mutually beneficial? And yet we see right now, currently, we have this great kind of battle back and forth between political systems instead of doing what? Forming a more perfect union. And so ultimately that leads us to Amendment 11. We'll end it here in just a second. The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens of subjects of any foreign state. And so this is about like suits against states versus states. And so now what happens when we have issues between the states, right? And so, again, we can't enforce unreasonable laws for people of other states that would contradict the Constitution. And so there's a way now that even within state to state, there's a way to address grievances one to another, right? And so we preserve, again, the right to create an ability for the union to work together in harmony, right? Because a healthy culture is a harmonious culture. Think about that with, again, in the context of our people. If we decided we're going to do things our own way, that would harm the culture as a whole. If we weren't being mindful of the cultures around us, the other peoples around us, right? And we said, we're not going to include them in our conversation or in relationship with us, only when it works for us, right? If we were just doing our own thing, again, that creates disunity as a whole. It undermines. And again, this is the great problem of culture building, is that culture requires individuals to be invested and involved, right? There's a commitment. How are cultures destroyed? They're destroyed one person at a time by one individual. It takes one person. I mean, and think about this honestly for a second. Isn't it so easy to derail yourself with one bad decision? Doesn't it seem like you have to take it takes 1,000 good decisions to get to a certain place, and one bad decision can bring you all the way back? Right. I mean, again, there's this at the heart of it. There's this really design that cultures are built through living and submission as individuals. And so we see that, again, constitutionally speaking, how things are ultimately built up. We'll end it here. Last amendment, we won't read all of it, is the election of the president. And so they kind of finalized here saying, we need to probably have a very specific way of how we have electors and ultimately how we get presidents in office. And this is where we get the Electoral College, right? And why is this important for us? Because, again, we are not strictly a democracy in the sense of, popular vote doesn't win the presidency. Just because you have more votes doesn't mean anything, because we want equal representation with the states. What this forces presidents to do is make sure that they're addressing the issues of every state, not just the states that have the most population, right? That would be a problem. I mean, think about it again in the context of any group of people. If we only did what one of the families wanted to do all the time, wouldn't those other families at some point just be like, this is kind of a bummer deal? That would create some disunity, would it not? And so again, I know I keep saying the same things over and over again. I do that intentionally because I really want to drive home this idea and understanding of culture building. And we're talking ultimately, Tim and Emmanuel do a far better job of communicating that as far as our people are concerned. But what my hope is that, again, we're building an understanding outside of that context of how cultures were shaped. Because America's a pretty great country to live in, comparatively when we look around the world. And there's a reason for that. It's not because America is just, because we live here and it's America and, yeah, 4th of July, fireworks. No, there's rights that were established, and there were people that were following really a higher mandate. They believed that they were ordained for something greater. That the whole idea of American values was born out of, originally, religious freedom to have your own voice and to be able to state that voice. And what we see now is, again, the playing out of that, and how we build culture is significant, because as we look at the way the country was formed, it was formed with great intention. And I really want to drive this home. I have to separate you two.
It's all
I want to drive this idea home, because how does this practically play out for us? In fact, you guys touched on this in your humility and pride essays. It means that we as individuals in God's house must be submitted ultimately to an authority that we limit ourselves and that we consider others, and that we're mindful in the way that we communicate one to another, the way that we submit to leadership, not just for our own sake, but we submit to leadership for the sake of those around us. That when difficult things come across our path, how do we make decisions? Who do we submit to? What does that look like? Because any healthy culture needs people to be foundationally strong. When you look at cultures of the world, look at how their people act, and that will tell you a lot about what the culture looks like. Honestly, let's look at our country for a real quick second, and we'll close it here. Is the current state of our country, would you say it is a positive culture or is it a negative culture?
Negative.
Why is it a negative culture in your
There's a
mind?
lot of things that have been happening, especially the last couple years, that should never have become a thing. Like, it wasn't God's intention. Well, it was purpose, because he would have stopped it if he wanted to, but
Yeah.
it wasn't the intention for a lot of the things to be illegal and a lot of the things to happen.
Good. Any other opinions, thoughts? Esther? I know you're quiet and you're thinking and you're writing notes.
What was the question?
Looking at our country, would you say it right now that we're currently living as a people in a positive culture, or is it more of a negative culture?
More negative.
And why would you say that?
I feel like people have I've said this before, but people have way too many rights,
Mm-hmm.
and the states are kind of letting it happen, and letting people do whatever they want.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a negative area.
And here's the trick. You said, I'm glad you answered it that way, because that's very insightful. They have too many rights. Those rights are protected. How do we fix a culture? The rights can't be, this is my right. Rights, properly understood, are tempered by the inclination for us, we the people, right? That's, I have rights. I'm a people. I have rights, but how does it continue? We the people, in order, what's the purpose? In order to form a more perfect union. Somebody who understands those rights understands that my rights have to be limited, not by the government, not by the states, but by me as an individual. So although I have the right to speak how I wish, it is not beneficial for the culture, for the union together, for me to always do that. And so culture properly understood is submission to proper authorities, ordained authority, God-given authority. All right, that's it for next week. Let's continue to practice the concept of culture and really be thoughtful about what that looks like for you. And you don't have to break out of your comfort zone if you don't want, but be mindful of how you are shaping culture, following culture, invested in culture. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you.